My name is Aimee Grant and I was the lead editor for using documents in research, and I forgot to show it this morning. Here it is. You can also see it up on my presentation there. And the co-editor of the same book is Helen Carruthers, who's also here co-chairing with me today. So before we talk about today's speakers, I just wanted to point out that Policy Press, our publishers, have been really generous and given us a 50% discount code. So if you buy it directly from them on the Policy Press website, you can get the book for half price, and that's valid until the end of July. And the code you would use for that is DSC50. Now, before I hand over to our first speaker, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why we decided to edit this book. So I've been using documents as data for a really long time, over 20 years now, and there just wasn't any methodological guidance at all when I started. And I've used them quite consistently throughout my career, my undergraduate, master's, PhD, and then 15 years of postdoctoral research. And we have got more books over the years, but I've started trying to write the books I wish I had. So in 2019, Routledge published Doing Excellent Social Research with Documents, and that was a series of 6 case studies from my research. But once I'd written it, I realised it wasn't really accessible enough for undergraduates and maybe some master's students. So then Policy Press published Doing Your Research Project with Documents for me in 2022. But I thought so much of this is just me saying what I think, and I thought it would be really good to open up the literature more widely. I think it can be quite hard to get methods papers published on things like documents because it's seen as like so basic, but it's actually really complex. And I'd never edited a book before, so I invited Helen Carruthers to join me. So Helen is an excellent methodologist who writes loads of great books on ethics and creative research, and she's also a really experienced editor. So I was really delighted when Helen said yes to joining me. So that's about the book. And now just a little bit of housekeeping then. So do feel free to write in the chat throughout, add any thoughts and reflections, as well as questions for the authors. Each speaker, when they come on, will introduce themselves, speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have another few minutes for questions. But at the end of the session, we'll have about 10 minutes left for questions as well. So there should be plenty of time, and I'm sure the authors will dip into the chat after their presentations. Unfortunately, one of the speakers we advertised originally, Orla Murray, had to withdraw due to UCU strike action. So in the UK, our union that university staff are in is called UCU, and we have huge rounds of redundancies and restructures at the moment. And Orla isn't actually on strike today, but because she's been on strike so much, it would be a struggle to fit this in. And we absolutely fully support Orla in doing this. So that was everything that I wanted to say. So I'm going to hand over to Helen Abnett now. So if I stop sharing that slide, and Helen did some really, really meticulous analysis, and she'll be speaking about charity annual reports and accounts from 2 different studies today and how organisations represent themselves in those documents. So I'll hand over to Helen now.
Thank you so much, Aimee. Can everyone just see my screen before I start? Brilliant. Thank you very much for confirming. So hi, thank you again, Aimee and Helen, for the amazing editing. It's such a privilege to be a part of this book and really great to be here as part of this launch. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my chapter. Just before I do that, I'll just introduce myself. So I'm Helen. I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Research in Public Health and Community Care at the University of Hertfordshire. And my research interests are all around kind of understanding and problematising the role of charity in the delivery of public services. And I've been working on that in academia for about 8 years, including doing a PhD during that time. But the interest is really born out of kind of the previous work I did before I joined academia and started my PhD. I spent about 15 years working in the charity sector, working with charities primarily within fundraising. And it was that experience that really kind of led me down this sort of more academic path, thinking about the role of charities. So I'm going to be talking today, as Aimee said, about the chapter that I have in this book, which is all about reflecting on using charity annual reporting to consider questions of representation. So I'm just going to start by sort of outlining a little bit of the chapter, and then again, as Aimee said, kind of reflecting on why I wrote it and perhaps what's interesting, I think, around it particularly, and also how it could be taken forward. So yeah, the chapter that I've written is all about using charity annual reports and accounts as research documents. So just for those who might not know, I use documents from English and Welsh charities, and most larger English and Welsh charities are required not only to prepare annual reports and accounts, but also to submit those to the Charity Commission for England and Wales, which is the charity regulator. And then the Charity Commission has a register, an online database effectively, where they then publish all these annual reports and accounts, as well as lots of other information about these charities. And they publish those annual reports and maintain them available online for free for up to 5 years. So in England and Wales, we have this huge resource that's available free to download online with lots of information about charities, including their annual reports and accounts. And what I mean by annual reports and accounts is probably quite straightforward. It's their financial information which they submit. And then the charities also required to produce annual reports. The rules about what they have to include in that report are different for different sizes of charities, but effectively all those reports have some information about what they do, their kind of impact, the work they do, who they work with, and then some information about their management and governance arrangements. And these are official documents. They're kind of regulatory documents, and they appear in chapter 3 of this fantastic book around using official documents. But what's really interesting for me is thinking about these sort of official sounding documents or official seeming documents as constructed accounts. They are representational. And when I talk about representation, what I mean is kind of how charities describe who they are, the message they construct around who they are, what they do, who they represent, and who they work with. And so I'm really interested in that sort of tension or that sort of understanding of these seeming official documents as actually constructed and representational accounts. So in this chapter, I actually drew on 2 different studies and reflected on the kind of challenges of both of those, what they both achieved, the gaps in both of those. Study 1 I used reflecting on a piece of work I did that used thematic analysis to look at the kind of partnership descriptions in international development charities, reports and accounts. And then study 2, which I did with some fantastic co-authors, looked at really detailed expenditure data for NHS-linked charities. So yeah, as I said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why I decided to write the chapter, what I think are kind of interesting methodological insights or interesting insights about reflecting on those 2 studies, and then how people could use the methods. In terms of deciding to write the chapter, it was a really great opportunity. I'm, again, really grateful to Aimee and Helen for giving me this opportunity. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this chapter was really this idea of sharing this potential goldmine that Corder and McConville have called it, of free online data. So as I said, in England and Wales, we are really fortunate. We have this massive resource that is available for inquiry, for research purposes. There are obviously ethical questions around that, which I'll come to later, but there is a huge resource of documents that we are privileged to have in England and Wales that I think could be used more, not just for research that only looks at research with documents, but to kind of support all different kinds of research and research questions. So it's all about, I just kind of want to share, make sure everyone knows that we have this massive resource in England and Wales, and let's use it as much as possible. Also, as I've talked about, this idea that they can sometimes be seen as just official documents, and lots of fantastic research has used these as documents, kind of thinking from a compliance perspective, like how much do they accord with the regulations, are they following the rules? And that's obviously really important and really interesting research. But I think it's also really important to look at these as constructed accounts, to think about the voice, to think about discourse, to think about the language, all these kind of critical ideas around how charities are using language. And also, it was a really fun opportunity for me writing the chapters just to reflect on what I did in these 2 quite different studies, how I used things differently, and what I did and what else I could have done. So in terms of the methodological insights, what I talk about in the chapter is 3 different aspects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, methods, and the data sources. In both of these studies, and kind of reflecting on thinking about these 2 different studies, it was really apparent that they were both very theory driven. I come from a kind of sociological, social policy type background, and theory, the kind of theoretical approach really shaped what became visible in the document. So it both kind of determined the questions I asked, the types of findings, but also really helped me to think through these documents as constructed accounts, and to kind of really think about the kind of hidden meanings, the underlying meanings within these documents. So, for example, in the second study, which was looking about NHS-linked charity accounts, we drew on a theory that actually been developed in the States around kind of grant-making charities to think about whether charities were positioning themselves as kind of filling the gaps of government or actually kind of supporting government provision, and thinking about that in the broader context of the UK welfare state and applying that in terms of our understanding of charity in the state was really interesting. But it was really kind of driven by that theoretical question. And it was really interesting to think again on reflecting on the two different studies, how the different theoretical approaches kind of led us down very different paths. In these two studies, I also used quite different methodologies. They're both qualitative methodologies. But for the first study, which was around kind of partnership representation by international development charities, we used thematic analysis. While for the second, we used a kind of much more specific qualitative content analysis. So the first study, we looked at these documents kind of in a whole. So we looked at the whole of the annual reports and accounts. I should say I looked at the whole of the annual reports and accounts as documents as a whole. And the use of thematic analysis allowed me to kind of generate themes and identify patterns across the document, which actually really led to, I think, what is the most interesting finding of this study, which is to really understand how charities presented themselves differently in different sections of the document. So we can see in the kind of more impact-focused sections, they talked about themselves in one way, whereas in the management sections, they talked about themselves and their partners in quite different ways. And it was the use of thematic analysis and this kind of thinking about themes and patterns that really allowed that finding to come out. And again, combining that with a particular theory kind of led us down certain paths. Whereas kind of the very different methodology we used for study two, which was really focused on the detail of the data, came out with really interesting findings, but very different to the kind of findings we got from the first study. And then, as I kind of hinted at, the type of data was crucial. So although both of these studies used annual reports and accounts, they used them in really, really different ways. Study one, as I said, used this kind of the whole of the document, kind of saw it as a big piece of work. I really looked at differences between the document. For study two, we looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of lines, literally, of detailed accounting data, and really focused on what was effectively a very small part of many, many reports. And really kind of thought about what those kind of really detailed ideas told us about these ideas of representation. And it was really interesting using accounting and financial data to think about representation. It was a really interesting application of this kind of idea. But it was, again, this kind of the type of data linked to the methods and the theory was really crucial in kind of understanding our questions. Obviously, both the approaches have limitations, as all research does. I think three that I think are really important to note is the time-consuming nature of this work. Like we literally went by hand for the second study through thousands of lines of accounting data, and it took a really, really long time. So it is really time-consuming. I think there's also a question around both of these methods are quite summative. We kind of came out with big themes and big ideas, and some of the kind of nuance and detail of the data then obviously gets lost in that. And I think that's a question mark around some of this type of work. And also the really important one, the really crucial one here is around voice. So although I've kind of sold the benefits of using charity annual reports, and I firmly believe in the benefits of using charity annual reports, we also have to really recognise they are a single voice of the organisation. And usually they are the senior voice in the international development charities. They are the kind of the voice in London often. And that really does give us particular perspective. So just coming to my last couple of points, I think overall what I've tried to share is that the kind of findings emerge because of this idea of theory and methods and data source. In terms of future use, I think there's lots of applications of this. I think everyone should use these reports when they're doing research around charities, but I think you can also apply it to other organisational documents, internal and external. And I think kind of doing the comparison would be really interesting. There is a big question, obviously, around using machine learning and AI and all those things. We actively chose not to use that. We felt that it was really important that we were using the data, but there are many discussions to be had, I think, around using kind of machine learning with these documents. And then finally, I think building in this kind of document research with other research methods is really interesting. Something I would love to do is take some of the, for example, the International Development Annual Reports and talk to people that they talk about in the reports, kind of get them to look at the reports and discuss those. And I think that would be really, really useful. And then that's just the references in case that's of use to everyone. And thank you very much. And again, thank you to Aimee and Helen for amazing editing and for allowing me to kind of share about the chapter in this launch as well.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really lovely. I can see you've got lots of people clapping in the background there. I think it's absolutely fascinating. Something I really liked in your research was that you brought in two different types of data and two different types of analysis. So huge thanks to Helen Abnett for coming along today. And we're now going to move on to Max Perry. So Max will be drawing on science and technology studies to focus on medical records and the way they shape doctor-patient interactions. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to you now, Max.
Sorry, I accidentally unmuted myself by turning my video off. I will fix that now. Okay, some thumbs up. Can we see my slides? You can probably see them in presenter mode. Is that better?
Yes.
We can see them as they should be.
Fantastic. So I'll keep my kind of introduction very brief because I know I'm going to run over because I've scripted this. So I'm going to talk quite quickly and I'll keep a relatively brief introduction. But I'm Max Perry. I currently work at the University of Edinburgh as a postdoc, and there I work in the Science, Technology and Innovation Studies department. And pretty much you can just think of me as the guy who's obsessed with medical records. That has been my career both before academia and in academia. So, first off, let me thank Helen and Aimee for not just inviting me to speak today, but inviting me to be part of the book. It was a kind of genuine pleasure to be involved. These things are normally long and difficult, I'm told. For me, it was long, but I guess it wasn't difficult, right? So thank you very much for having me involved. Today, I'm going to talk about how I got involved in the project, and in so doing, I hope we can kind of isolate some of my prior interests and see how they shaped the chapter that I wrote. And at the end, I'll briefly provide some account of the kind of main substance of the chapter itself. So, I finished my PhD in Bristol in 2024. During that PhD, I shared supervisors actually with the fantastic Policy Press editor Paul Stevens, who's writing his own really fascinating PhD, which I encourage you to all go and read. But Paul, through our connection and knowing that I had written a PhD on medical records, advised Helen and Aimee to send the call on to me for the chapter. Now, I actually had some kind of initial concerns about this. Although I basically spent all of my time writing and thinking about documents, I wasn't sure that I had much to say about the methods of using documents. Nonetheless, I kind of sent a short pitch to Aimee and Helen outlining what would become this chapter. I was emboldened by a kind of certain nihilism that is afforded to those with low expectations, and so I suggested that I write a philosophically inclined reflection on how social scientists make knowledge claims from the use of documents. Now, in some ways, this is kind of pretentious. Of course, writing about making knowledge claims is just writing about methods. However, I do think there is need for more methodological literature that engages deeply with what it is to claim to know something, and particularly for us social scientists to think long and hard and to write clearly and frequently about the nature of our own knowledge. That is what I'm attempting in the chapter. I do want to add that I know this is a kind of a humble endeavour. I do not want to claim novelty or profound wisdom. I just want to guide people towards a particular kind of critical relationship with documents vis-a-vis their sociality. So, to elaborate on the chapter itself, I'm going to first talk about a game I often play with, when I'm teaching first-year sociology students. And the game basically starts by me and the students all naming an object, and then in turn we speculate on how those different sciences might study each object. The game is a tool to help us think sociologically, and my intention was always to get the students in this context to think about what was specific about social scientific inquiry. Briefly, together, I'd like us to play this game, imagining that someone had made their object a document. So let's first think about a mathematician's approach. To approach a document mathematically, we might think about it in terms of its dimensions. We might then think about abstracting how many sheets it would take to build a structure as tall as the Eiffel Tower. Now, these are all quite basic questions, I'm sure, for a mathematician. But then let's think about a chemist. They might be interested in the surface chemistry of a document and how that shapes the relationship between ink and paper. Now, a linguist might be interested in the properties of the language used on the surface of the paper, and on and on. We can go through other sciences should we choose. Now, when we get to the social scientist, we need to start to isolate some questions about the document that concern something different to those other disciplines, something regarding its sociality. I'll give a more profound example of this later, but for now, let's kind of keep things simple. Let's imagine the document is a basic administrative form, like a job application. A sociologist might be interested to ask why certain questions become more important than others to the bureaucracy. Why is disability reported but under promise of anonymity in a job application? Why does a pub need to record an employee's passport numbers? Now, clearly these questions are, at least superficially, not particularly complicated. But then again, neither are those of the mathematician, the chemist, and the linguist that we talked about. So far I haven't taken us very far. This is a kind of simple first step in doing research. My intention is in taking so long to bring us just this little way is that I think it is the first step that provides such a profound barrier to social research when using documents. For those scientists that have lab equipment, certain precise and clear operations, or like mathematics and linguistics, a language and object, numbers and words, that are so clearly defined, the first step is made easier. For us social scientists, precision is more easily lost as our laboratories are more porous and our hold over our object of study is less well established. What I want to suggest is that we consider not the causality of a document, what made it, but instead locate its social conditions of possibility, and that this is a distinct and more precise scientific engagement. Let me, as promised, provide a slightly more detailed example from the chapter itself. So here's an outpatient clinic letter, which I refer to in the chapter. I could talk about these for a very long time, should we wish to, but let's just for now say that these are letters that are written after an appointment with a specialist. This one's from a gastroenterology appointment. It's actually a template letter, so it's kind of fabricated, but we'll forget that for now. So after a gastroenterology appointment, a doctor will, one way or another, produce a letter that looks like this. A copy will be filed in the notes, another will be sent to the patient's local GP, and a third will be sent directly to the patient. So, let's just take one question that I write about in the chapter. Why is smoking considered an important routine statistic to record, but, for example, exercise tolerance is not? There's a temptation to regard this as a clinical question. However, it is only clinical in its causality. To understand its conditions of possibility, a sociologist is needed as well. So, how might we isolate some social conditions of possibility? We might start by saying smoking might be important in some cases, but not all. But here we can see that smoking status is always recorded. Couldn't we trust a doctor to ask about and record it if it is important to the case? Indeed, doesn't the NHS know who smokes because this is already a fact established by the GP? Why, if smoking is a clinical matter, is it, and alcohol intake, recorded in a social history section? And why does this section not also record how much exercise a person does or how much sugar and fats they eat, all of which can be equally important clinical facts in diagnosis and treatment? So I hope you can see that I'm starting to amass all manner of interesting sociological questions regarding healthcare. I don't want to answer these here, but hopefully we can agree that there are certain social problems in the document that we might try to face down that might otherwise be left alone as clinical in nature. So I've still talked a lot, and we've only taken 2 very small steps to say that social science is different to mathematics in some ways, but that different social scientific inquiry can be pointed at an object, including documents, productively. So, to try and take a bigger step, I want to offer 3 thoughts which are central to the chapter and emerge from the small steps we have taken thus far. In pursuing this way of asking social questions of documents, I offer 3 ethics which might help guide us: triangulation, maximalization, and slantwise writing. So by triangulation, I mean how we contextualize the document. The document cannot just be understood as a self-evident fact. It must be placed into a context of social practice. The outpatient letter must be understood as a bureaucratic form, something with an organizational history, a certain politics, a technical and material reality in the clinic, a set of audiences, doctor, GP, patient, etc., etc. By maximalization, a term I borrow from Paul Feyerabend, I mean that a social scientist should look for as many connections as possible, follow as many avenues as they can, and leave nothing cordoned off to some other way of knowing. That is, if the mathematician is interested in the dimensions of a document, that is all very good, but a sociologist might still be interested to inquire about how standardization happened around particular dimensions, for example, A4 paper.
You've got 2 minutes, Max, if you didn't see Helen.
Thank you very much, Aimee. I should be all right, actually. To quote Feyerabend, a scientist who wishes to maximize the empirical content of the views he holds, who wants to understand them as clearly as he possibly can, must therefore introduce other views. That is, he must adopt a pluralistic methodology. So finally then, I want to offer slantwise writing, a term I borrow from Louisa Moore, who uses it in a longer essay about Foucault and parrhesia. Moore is following a particular argument about critique that I shan't discuss too much here, but she suggests that we should allow ourselves as researchers to take up strategic vantage points, to elucidate some series of things and then step away from that vantage point and pursue a new avenue. I like it because it calls back to the game I talked about earlier. It is to accept that a sociological inquiry into a document is a strategic position taken. Indeed, even within this sociological position, many different vantages can be taken. To write slantwise is to avoid totalizing the object, to allow room for other folk, mathematicians, chemists, etc., to have their say. We write slantwise in such a way that we can cut into something, but without claiming some ownership over the object itself. Those are the things I hope we can take away from the chapter. Thank you for listening. Sorry for going over.
You didn't go over. You were 8 seconds under.
Excellent.
Sorry
for talking fast.
Well, that may be. But thank you. And one thing that was so interesting for me about your presentation and Helen's is that together they really exemplify some of the diversity of work that can be done with documents, and some of the diversity. Documents have so much potential for researchers, and at present I think it's so underused, which was my own motivation for getting involved with this whole project in the first place. That's great. Thank you. I think that, again, everything I'm hearing kind of opens out and broadens this discussion. And I know that Dr. Abby Winter is going to do this too, broaden it further and give us another dimension to consider. So over to you, Abby.
I'm just hopefully going to be sharing the correct version of my presentation. Hi, I'm Abby. Like Helen and Max, thank you so much, Aimee and Helen Cara, for the opportunity to be part of this lovely, wonderful book. I came to it through Helen's blog, I believe. That was how I first saw the call and said to my team, ooh, we have a place that we might be able to put a thing. Because I'm in Australia and it's nighttime, hence the lights are on, we always begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands where we are. For me, that's the Turrbal and Yugara people in Meanjin, which we Westerners call Brisbane in Australia. And I recognise that these lands where I am have always been places of teaching and learning and research and creativity and arts making and storytelling. This chapter is not a sole authored publication. We have quite a large team. This is a portion of the team who actually worked on the funded research project. So back in, I might have the year wrong, 2019 to 2021, Australia instituted a Royal Commission, which is a federal government inquiry into the aged care sector. The lady on the end, Yvonne, with the gorgeous scarf on, was the project lead. TJ was our resident journalist. Jen is our resident researcher artist. Sarah was our postdoctoral research fellow. And I'm the, waving to Aimee, precarious, waving to Helen, independent researcher who helps out with everybody on the team. I broadly present what I do as writing coach, which means I get to help researchers, whether they're staff or students, with any aspect of their research, from I've had an idea, can we talk it through, all the way to I've written a thing, can you please proofread it and make sure that the referencing style is correct for the place that I'm sending it to. So we had 3 years worth of funding to amplify the voices of the submissions to the Royal Commission. We started by Sarah, our postdoc, went to the Royal Commission website, which has now been archived, which is what you're seeing a screenshot of, and went through the 10,000 odd submissions that actually exist to download lots and lots of them. We then selected some of them, and we had to make choices at that point because our goal was amplification, and transformational learning is what we ended up deciding we wanted to do with these things. So we had to pick stories that weren't just, I've been in aged care for 3 years and it's terrible and awful. We also didn't want to pick the stories that were so harrowing and traumatic that, you know, we as researchers, let alone anybody else, would be able to engage with them. So we chose a selection of them, and from that selection, we then reduced down, and the 3 that you're seeing on the screen and which are in the chapter are examples that we've actually used for part of the work. What we did was we took the submissions and turned them into letters. So we added at the top, hello there, I want to tell you my story. Everything else on each of those pages is absolutely real as it was submitted to the Royal Commission, either with the person's own name or with a pseudonym. At the very bottom of the documents on the screen, you'll see there is a small code number. That's the Royal Commission reference number. So everything that we were using had already been read and analysed and organised as part of the Royal Commission process. We were taking the documents that had been submitted and plopped away in the archive, so they're available on the web for anybody to use, but who's going to go see them? We came to see them, we've pulled them out, we're trying to do more things with the documents. And we're doing this, and I apologise, this is a very, bad screenshot of Yvonne's book about using creative arts-based research in aged care. So she's both aged care expert and creative arts expert. So she's done a lot of photo voice work where she gives people a camera and says, take the photos and then tell me the story about the photo. She does research poetry, and a lot of the work that we did as part of this project was in research poetry, and we briefly mentioned that in the chapter. What we did was, because we had taken the documents and turned them into letters, we thought, let's get people who all attended an exhibition. Let's ask them to respond to the letters in their own letters of response. And we got, people wrote back, and people took a lot of time and a lot of care. And we found that it was really a transformational part of the process for them, because they were getting engaged. They weren't just seeing a news story that, shows an old person sitting in a chair going, oh, isn't it sad? They were actually reading the stories of these people and responding. And a lot of them thought that that their responses would be sent on to the people who had done the submissions, which we then had to explain that we couldn't do because some of them are anonymous. We don't know. We don't have anybody's address. And we actually asked them, and I don't have a photo of it, we brought in some letterboxes. And once they'd written their letter, they could fold it up and put it in an envelope and post it into a letterbox. So we gave them the whole experience. Our researcher artist decided that she wanted to do some machine learning work. Thank you, Helen, for raising that as a possibility. And she started off by doing a concrete poem, which is a poem written in a particular shape. From that poem, which was based on one of those 3 letters that we've used throughout the chapter, she then got the machine learning, and the details of what she did and how she did it are in the chapter, asked the machine to come up with some artworks because she thought the poem's not quite sufficient. The exhibition was in a space at our university, which you can see in these lower right hand. So we actually have a hanging sphere, which is probably about the size of the room that I'm in. It's a massive thing, basically hanging between 2 floors of a building. And we projected the artwork onto it. So you can walk around it, you can see it from above, you can see it from below. There was also then a digital wall beside it that explained what was going on. The pictures at the top here, and we talk about this quite a bit in the chapter, the machine had basically been trained that if we include old, then it's hands and it's white hands. So there were issues around the database that she was using. Other things that we did with the documents, including we did lots of stuff around research poetry. Sarah and I ran workshops teaching people how to create their own research poetry, again, using the documents from the Royal Commission. We actually had an award-winning poet, Sarah Abnett, as part of the team. She and Yvonne did a whole heap of other stuff as well. But broadly, we took the documents and we tried to make them come alive for people in some ways. So we didn't just say, here is a document, treat it as a document. Same story Max was telling, same story Helen was telling. Documents aren't just documents. They can be more for people.
Great stuff. Thank you. And again, within time. You guys are awesome. I didn't even have to use my special time's up sign. Thank you, Abby. And again, I do think that has, as I predicted, again, broadened out the scope of what people can do with documents. And although these 3 presentations that we've heard are really diverse, there's a whole lot more as well. And there's a whole lot more that hasn't even been invented or thought of.
And I'm now going to ask José Ragas to talk to us about his research on identity documents like passports in the global south. And I found it really interesting that José found some of his documents in archives, but also some in flea markets. So over to you, José.
Thank you so much, Aimee. It's great to be here, and thank you to all who are joining us this afternoon. So my name is José Ragas, and I'm a Peruvian scholar, but I'm based in Santiago de Chile, where I teach courses on and seminars on history, science, and technology. I'm currently in Princeton, where I'm working on my book manuscript. So I was very excited when I saw the original call for papers for this edited volume, like a few years ago, because most of the call for papers or even edited volumes are about specific topics or themes, right? So, but not many of them, they are about sources. Not many of them are about documents or historical documents. So I I thought it was an opportunity and to just to step back a little bit and give maybe another reflection on how this material, how these the documents are the foundation of our discipline, can tell us about new ways to approach, new ways to read them, new ways, especially in a moment where the discipline is changing very rapidly. No, it's happening here in the. I see here in the U.S. I see in Chile. I see in Peru, for example, how artificial intelligence is changing that, but still, among the discussion about how the documents are going to be read, are going to be analyzed, I mean, it's part of an ongoing conversation that we need to have in publicly and also beyond our offices and beyond the academia. So I was very excited about this because, and I wanted to write about something that's the wonderful thing about technology, that it's become so ubiquitous, so common sometimes, that I wanted to write about something that we take for granted, which are the ID cards, the personal documents, no? And something, when I was thinking about what to say today, I was in Philadelphia a few days ago, and when I wanted to buy a beer, for example, the guy in the store, he asked me for a document to prove that I was older. I was older than 18 years old. So I showed them like 3 different documents, and he didn't buy it. Now he didn't. I couldn't prove that I was 18 years old, and I wasn't able to buy a beer here in the U.S. And he asked me to show him my passport. I said that I don't carry my passport because it's very risky. Because my visa is there. I'm going to do that. So I was thinking about sometimes how we take for granted these specific devices, how we take for granted documents. For example, sometimes we carry them in our pockets, we carry them in our purses, we carry them in different formats, no, from printed, like sometimes in paper, sometimes now we are in our cell phones, right? And how this has been changing, but not only is a device, but it's how this specific device has changed the relationship between us, technology, the state, and even with other people, right? Because it's not just that you have or not this specific device. It's what does it mean to have an identity card, no? And since we are very lucky because we have one, sometimes we tend to forget that there are many people that they don't have an identity card, or even if they have one, they don't have the proper one. And so the chapter here is an exercise to understand what does it mean, how to analyze one specific technology, no? In this case, an identity card, and also where can we find them? And when we find them, how can we approach to this specific kind of technology, and what does it mean in terms of a social and cultural approach to technology? So this is more like a hybrid / combined method between historical investigation and STS, because I'm trying to understand more the cultural aspects of one specific technology like this identity card. No? So I use one particular example, if you allow me to show it, which is this one, which is called the. This is an internal passport. This is a document that was, it was the first document in Spanish America. It was very common, for example, in France during the French Revolution. It was very common in the US during the American Revolution, but it was the first time that it was used in Spanish America. So, and also something that I wanted to try to investigate more was how this specific device was the first maybe portable technology that people started to use in such early moment, in the early 19th century, but also how this, just because this is just a piece of paper, very rudimentary, but how this specific device became the foundation for facial recognition, something that we use that in our phones, in our cameras, and in other venues. So, for example, what you can see here is called the features of personal signals, and this is the first time that it was recorded in terms of the face, the kind of hair, the eyebrows, the eyes, and the nose, and many other information. So the chapter is more like an invitation to reflect about how to approach to these documents, how can we find different perspectives to just not to focus on the information, but also in how people interacted with these documents. Many of them, for example, they carried in on a daily basis. Some people they decided just not to use them, and some people, something that I learned about this, decided to, for example, counterfeit the documents, or decided to forge, for example, the signatures. So the chapter that I wrote here is more like to show the rich tapestry of practices and interactions that we can find with this specific device in particular, with a specific, even though it's a very simple piece of paper, or even it's a more sophisticated document now, like passports or visas. I mean, the way that people have been interacting with these kind of these documents has changed over time, and this kind of interaction also had social and political implications. The way why authorities decided to change the way that these documents were generated, the way that people learn how to sign for these documents, or even how they were able to access or change information here, is something that now we can see that is part of the current debate on personal data, on personal information, how we use personal information, how we give personal information, for example, on social media, how people or how companies, for example, use that specific information from us in order to control or even to sell more products and all of that. So the chapter is, again, is an invitation. I mean, I had a lot of fun writing the chapter because, I mean, it was a way to also to expand my own methodological knowledge, and also I wanted to use this specific kind of instrument that maybe is not very common in other parts of the world, but also that laid the foundation for other documents in the global south. For example, the passports in South Africa, for example, and that is happening also here in different communities, in different groups, and how we can use these documents not only to move away from this idea that they were only instruments of operation of surveillance, but also they were ways to reclaim citizenship. That
2
many
minutes.
Thank
2
you.
minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So, because of this kind of social and cultural approach, this kind of ethnography that I use, so the idea was also to how other scholars or how other people can take advantage of this approach, And the idea is that technology offers many possibilities to understand this kind of and not only to focus on the hardware or the material aspects, but also the meanings, the symbolisms that entails every technology, especially in this case with the identity cards. So I think it's an open debate. I mean, and it was also just to show the richness of one specific element, and how we can keep thinking and keep talking about how to understand the role of these specific instruments, like personal documents that had in the past, and how they have shaped the present, and how can we make them to work for us as citizens in the future. Thank you.
Wow, Jose, that was amazing. I wrote so many notes in there, and I think so often when we're thinking about documents, we're not thinking about the human lives that are touched by them. And I think, you've just made it so clear how important these identity documents are. So we're now going to move on to Kate. So Kate, if you'd like to share your slides. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, Kate asked women academics to write diaries about their lives. And then afterwards, she interviewed those who'd written the diaries and created a fascinating online archive. So it'll be a real pleasure to hear about some of that today. So over to you, Kate.
Just waiting for the screen to move around. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, so good evening. It is pretty much evening now, isn't it? So it's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk about my chapter in this edited collection. I'm Kate Carruthers Thomas. I'm an associate professor of higher education and gender at Birmingham City University. and I bring sociological, geographical and educational theories and concepts to bear on primarily qualitative research into gendered issues of work in higher education. And I also have form when it comes to creative methods, particularly in research dissemination. So, as Aimee says, this chapter focuses on my experiences of working with diary entries and interview transcripts to create a public access illustrated digital archive. I didn't actually know what that was when I started, but I do now. It describes processes of gathering, curating, analysing, structuring, illustrating data and documents, and includes a case study with excerpts and some fairly basic ideas for using this method in other disciplines. So there are two key reasons why I decided to write the chapter. Firstly, I decided to submit the chapter in the first place because I knew if it was accepted for inclusion, then as an author, I'd be in really good hands, because I had written a chapter for one of Helen's edited collections before, and Aimee and Helen's call for chapters showed a really strong ethos of care and discipline in relation to the writing, reviewing and editing process. And I don't think that can be understated. Secondly, I tend to jump into creative projects quite instinctively, perhaps foolishly, and realise their demands and complexities when it's too late. So writing about methods, even or especially after the event, deepens my understanding of the research processes, allows me to examine in a very granular and thoughtful way what I did and why I did it in ways which may not have been obvious in the doing. So just some background and context for the project described in the chapter, with a very long title at the top, which I call Dear Diary for short. This project followed prior survey research that I'd done into the experiences of living and working at home during the early stages of the COVID pandemic in the UK. And this was with over 500 academic and professional services staff of all genders in my own university. Findings showed that women were more likely than men to take on primary or sole responsibility for homeschooling, household tasks and others' care needs, and less likely to have dedicated working space at home. For female academics with school-aged children and or care responsibilities for older people, working from home in the lockdown had a negative impact on their capacity to carry out research-related tasks, including applying for research funding, conducting projects, and writing for publication. So in late 2020, I was awarded funding from the Society for Research in Higher Education, SRHE, to investigate the experiences of 25 female academics in UK universities through those first 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I used a method called the diary interview method, or DDIM, to gather my data. So each participant was asked to submit 2 diary entries in any format, written, audio, video, between May and August 2021, one retrospective and one contemporaneous. I supplied separate prompts for each entry, and those are in the chapter. I then conducted an individual semi-structured interview, online of course, lasting between 45 and 60 minutes. So the documents in question, therefore, comprise 50 diary entries of varying lengths and 25 interview transcripts. What I found was, as Latham suggests here, that in using DDIM, the parallel narratives of the diary and the interview do not sum together to produce a single unified narrative, but an interrelated mosaic of interpretive snapshots and vignettes of a particular social space and social practices in the making. And that seemed particularly pertinent to the period of the COVID pandemic. So the chapter explains in some detail the kind of lengthy and cyclical process of thematic analysis I undertook with these documents. And this included generating 4 overarching themes: work, home, space, time, new normal, and well-being. each with several sub-themes. I also created individual participant data sets from which I would later select extracts from the archive. And those excerpts range from 75 to 275 words. And having collated them in theme and sub-theme order, I edited the longer extracts down to make them more suitable for online viewing and reading. And I gave each extract a short descriptive title using only the participants' words or phrases. The extracts were then ordered within each sub-theme section, in some cases to establish a loose narrative flow, and in others to juxtapose different perspectives on common experiences to convey the breadth and complexity of participants' data. So the inclusion of a case study in the chapter explains this process in some detail. The overarching themes also informed the archive's design. So I collaborated with a professional web designer, Ben Robertson, to decide on the look and feel of the site. I wanted the design to reflect both the physicality of an archive and the spatiality of my analytical framework. Ben and I came up with the concept of a two-dimensional exhibition space with a landing or home page featuring a floor plan of 4 galleries corresponding to those overarching themes. I then created a pen and ink illustration for each gallery page and then for selected excerpts throughout the archive. I stress here, as you could probably tell, I am not a trained artist in any sense, but I do use graphic form in my work. Some of the illustrations were intended to distill wider and gendered impact of the pandemic, and others were very personal to the participants, many of whom helpfully used visual language in their diary data. I also created a cabinet of curiosities for any content that I really wanted to include, but which didn't obviously align with the 4 themed galleries. Because not everything fits neatly into themes and sub-themes, and messiness is part of the joy of qualitative data as far as I'm concerned. So each of those, you click on each of those images and it goes through to the data, which is the participants' words, essentially.
2 minutes, Kate.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Thank you. The Dear Diary Illustrated Digital Archive remains online. The URL is there. It's now a historical artifact. In fact, it became that as soon as I started working on it. It's a version of that extraordinary period, which is grounded in research data and documents, grounded in the lived experiences and the words of the participants. As an archive, it's a form of repository, but in distilling the contents of those documents, textually and visually, it's much more than a passive storehouse of old stuff, as Schwartz and Cook talk about an archive. Part of the brief of this presentation was to talk about how other people could use your methods, but I always feel, Helen knows, I feel a bit stuck with this kind of question, as I would rarely recommend anybody to embark on the type of projects that I do. I think perhaps the most useful thing I can say is to be open to creativity and hybridity in thinking about research dissemination. Just because you use conventional methods to gather data doesn't prevent you from finding multiple ways to share that data with others. So finally, closing slide, I can see I've got 3 R's in my Carruthers there, which is wrong, it should be 2. Anyway, I'd like to close by saying a huge thank you to Aimee and Helen for being such excellent editors. Thanks to Ben Robertson, who designed the website and with whom I've continued to work in other ways. I hope you enjoy reading the chapter, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. So clear. I think, do we have questions? Anyone got a question for Kate? We're a small group, so we can take verbal questions, or you can use the chat if you prefer. Oh, that means your time's up. That was just my phone going off. We'll ignore that. Anyone got a question? While people are thinking, I have got one, which is, can you say a bit about who's using the archive? Do you know? Have you got stats? I mean, it seems like a really great resource, but who's using it and what for? Do we know?
That's quite hard to answer. You know, there was, as anything, when it first goes up, there's a flurry of interest, and actually that's, you know, that's an interesting question in terms of dissemination. It's like, when does dissemination end? So, you know, it took, I would periodically come back to it, and you know, mention the archive, link to the archive, etc. But one of my big beefs is that people think COVID is over, and many people don't want to think about it anymore. They don't want to talk about it anymore. So, you know, this really is now a historical artifact, as far as many people are concerned. In the work that I do, I can see the impacts are ongoing, and particularly the gendered impacts. There are many other impacts. So, you know, I know it's still relevant, and the something that happened actually just as I agreed to do the to accept this invitation was that the hosting ran out, and I didn't have any budget to renew it for a year, but I have now renewed it for a year, because not just because of this launch, obviously, but because, yeah, I think that in itself is an interesting question about research. When does it end?
And also an interesting question about digital anything, really, because there's a sort of, I think, a sort of misconception that if you put something on the internet, it'll just stay there forever, and it really doesn't.
No.
It needs preservation, it needs management, it needs you know, caretaking and all that stuff. And in this world where we move on from one project to another, and budgets run out and things change, people move, these things, you know, the number of sort of defunct repositories and websites around has to be increasing.
Yeah.
And I find them sometimes when I look up, you know, if I look up somebody's work and it's a funded project, and I try and find the website, and it's obviously, you know, not there anymore, and all of that is hard.
And I think some other work that I've done with these documents, if you like, talks about emotional labour, the women's emotional labour during the pandemic, my emotional labour as a researcher. But I kind of feel people gave a great deal in that project, and you know, I want to honour that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. Don't forget, everyone, there is a discount code. If you want a copy of the book, DSC50 will get you a half price copy. So that's got to be worth something. And that's valid till 31st of July for personal use. So huge thanks to all our speakers. I think it's been absolutely fascinating. And thanks everyone for attending. I hope you've found it useful.
So have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.